Clyde Shelton was having a quiet evening at home with his daughter. The atmosphere felt warm as Clyde focused on his work while his daughter was busy making a simple necklace for herself and her mother. But that nice moment got interrupted when two robbers broke in. Clyde opened the door, only to be hit hard by one of them. Shortly after, he found himself tied up with his mouth taped shut. In a cold voice, the robber said,
"You can't fight fate."
The tragedy for Clyde didn't just stop with him. One of the robbers, Darby, attacked his wife and daughter. The other robber, Ames, tried to intervene but couldn't do anything. Darby was so blinded by his cruelty that nothing could stop him. At the lawyer's office, Clyde was shocked when Nick told him that Darby testified against Ames, blaming him for the murder. Ironically, Darby, who was the real mastermind, only got a 5-year sentence, while Ames, who just followed orders, faced the death penalty. Clyde fought for justice, presenting DNA results and various arguments, but all his efforts felt pointless since the prosecutor ignored the evidence. In the courtroom, Bill, Darby's lawyer, successfully ensured that his client received only 5 years in prison. Meanwhile, Ames, who had already served 10 years, still faced the death penalty. Darby appeared quite pleased with this outcome, even making a cynical comment to Nick, "You can't fight fate." Outside the courtroom, Darby shamelessly reached out to shake Nick's hand as reporters crowded around them to ask about the trial. Clyde, watching from a distance, felt his anger rise at the sight. He believed the law had failed him, and those involved, including Nick, didn't seem to make a real effort to fight for the truth. 10 years passed, and finally the day of Ames' execution arrived. What was supposed to be a quick and painless procedure turned into a nightmare. Ames felt immense pain as the poison injected into him spread unevenly, causing his blood vessels to leak. He died in unimaginable agony. Feeling that something was off with the execution, Nick and the police jumped into action, launching an investigation. Soon, an officer found the fluid bag used during the execution. It looked like the bag had been swapped with a deadly poison which was the cause of Ames' suffering. To everyone's shock, the fluid bag had a message written on it, "You can't fight fate." This instantly reminded Nick of what Darby said a decade ago. Darby had used similar words the last time they met. Meanwhile, Darby was in his apartment, caught the news about Ames' execution. Just then his phone rang. The caller ID was unknown, making Darby feel uneasy. The mysterious voice on the phone warned Darby that the cops were coming for him. Panicking, Darby grabbed his gun and took off. While running, he tried to figure out who the mysterious voice was, but it just interrupted him, assuring him that it wanted to help. The voice directed Darby to an abandoned factory, claiming a police officer had been taken out. He was told he could use the officer's gun to defend himself. Arriving at the location, Darby quickly grabbed the unconscious policeman's gun and told him to move away from the spot. At the new location, Darby forced the officer out of the car and seemed ready to take him out. However, the officer begged for mercy, saying he still had to provide for his wife and child. Darby seemed unfazed when the sudden ring of the phone broke the silence. He answered the call nonchalantly, not realizing that the voice on the other end belonged to someone he knew. Darby was shocked when the undercover cop revealed his true identity. It was Clyde, the guy who had been hiding behind his careful disguise. In a panic, Darby tried to fire the gun he'd taken from Clyde. But instead of bullets, tiny needles shot out and pierced his hand. Clyde calmly explained that those needles contained tetrodotoxin, a poison that would quickly paralyze him. Even though Darby couldn't move, he would still be fully conscious, feeling every ounce of pain. In a corner of a deserted warehouse, Clyde, once a loving father, had turned into someone completely different. Cold and calculated, he showed surprising medical skill, mastering each step as if he were a seasoned surgeon. But the purpose of his knowledge was far from noble. Instead of helping Darby, Clyde cooked up a cruel form of suffering. He injected a saline solution into Darby's body, making sure he stayed aware throughout the whole ordeal, feeling every second of endless agony. Clyde recorded every moment of the torture with his camera, capturing every second of Darby's suffering. Wearing a welding mask, he started grinding Darby's feet while the camera rolled. But he couldn't hide his actions for long. The police quickly tracked him down and raided the place. Clyde, looking calm and unfazed, surrendered without a fight, as if everything had gone according to his plan. In prison, Nick tried to dig up more info from Clyde about the brutal murders of Ames and Darby, but Clyde just ignored him. Instead of answering, he coolly asked for a new mattress for his cell, complaining that the current one was too uncomfortable. Clyde even said he'd spill everything if his request was granted. Even though Nick hesitated at first to go along with Clyde's bizarre request, the urgency to solve the brutal murders of Ames and Darby pushed him to agree. He realized that this compromise might be the key to uncovering more truths. Another shock hit when Nick got a call from his wife. She told him their child was really traumatized after accidentally seeing the footage of Darby's torture and murder sent by an anonymous sender. The video caused chaos at home, adding to Nick's already heavy mental load. During the trial, it came out that Clyde had studied law for 10 years since the tragic events that took his wife and child. With his deep legal knowledge, he managed to game the system, just like Darby had slipped through the cracks. This time, law enforcement found themselves in a tough spot due to a lack of solid evidence to nail Clyde. A series of clever alibis, Clyde almost dodged punishment, but unexpectedly, he decided to confess his actions in court. On top of that, Clyde unleashed his anger at the legal system, which he saw as corrupt, even calling out the judge for being incompetent. Even though the evidence wasn't strong enough, the judge seemed ready to let Clyde go without looking for more proof. But after Clyde publicly shamed him with his confession, the trial was stopped, and he was found guilty of Ames and Darby's deaths. As if the deaths of Ames and Darby weren't enough, Clyde made a strange request. He wanted a stick and an iPod to go with his lunch. But hidden in that request was a threat to Bill, Darby's former lawyer, who was now in real danger. Realizing the real danger to Bill, Nick and the police had to fulfill Clyde's request. But they underestimated the deadline he set and ended up arriving 8 minutes late. Clyde coldly reminded them that he couldn't guarantee Bill's safety if they kept messing around. What happened next shocked everyone. When the police finally showed up at the spot Clyde indicated, they found Bill lifeless, bound, and buried in a box. As warned, Bill's life was beyond saving. It looked like the murder had been carefully planned. Nick found an oxygen tank set to run out exactly at 1:15 p.m. If only lunch had been delivered on time, the police might have had a chance to save the lawyer. Knowing this case was more complicated than it looked, Nick teamed up with his old colleague, Jonas, to dig deeper into who Clyde really was and what motivated him. Nick eventually met a guy who had worked with Clyde before. The guy warned Nick that Clyde wasn't just anyone. He was a trained killer who could take out his targets without much movement. He shared how Clyde had successfully eliminated targets that other teams couldn't reach, using carbon fiber ropes that slowly strangled his victims. Even though those targets usually escaped death despite being armed, Clyde managed it with a nearly undetectable method. The guy assured Nick that if Clyde really wanted him dead, it would have happened long ago. After getting info from the guy, Nick immediately asked the police to patrol around his house. He was getting more anxious about his family's safety and also started talking with Judge Laura about possibly giving Clyde a harsher sentence. Unfortunately for Judge Laura, who had also dealt with the case involving Clyde's wife and child, the phone she was using suddenly exploded in front of Nick and Jonas, taking her life instantly. Realizing the real threat from Clyde's actions, Nick immediately grilled the inmate about Judge Laura's murder. In a firm tone, he warned Clyde that his revenge wouldn't bring back his wife and child. Clyde, without missing a beat, argued that everything he did was to fix a justice system he thought was broken. Not stopping there, he made a new demand to Nick. This time his demands were much more extreme. Clyde wanted all charges against him dropped and insisted he be released before 6 a.m. the next day. If not, he threatened to kill everyone involved. When Clyde made his demands, Nick firmly refused to give in to the threats. As a precaution, he decided to keep all staff on site until 6 a.m. Nick was determined to protect everyone present, despite Clyde's looming threat. Unfortunately, as 6 a.m. passed without any signs of danger like Clyde had threatened, the staff who were about to leave faced a tragic fate. One by one, the cars parked in the prison area suddenly exploded, claiming their lives. The most surprising part was that out of all the destroyed cars, only Nick's vehicle escaped the blast. The other vehicles had bombs hidden in their fuel tanks, but Nick's car was untouched, as if it had been intentionally left intact. The next day, on his way to the funeral of his colleague who died in the explosion, Nick unexpectedly ran into Clyde. Filled with rage, Nick unleashed his anger by beating Clyde. Calmly, Clyde revealed that his actions were far from over. He vowed to keep hunting down every law enforcement officer he thought had failed in their duties. Clyde also shared his bigger goal, to destroy and rebuild the justice system he saw as corrupt. After the funeral, the convoy carrying Nick and his colleagues suddenly came to a stop. They quickly realized this was no coincidence. A robot controlled remotely had taken over. Unfortunately, the car that Jonas was in became the target of the robot's gunfire. A hail of bullets caused the vehicle to explode, killing Jonas inside. Unwilling to give up, Nick kept digging for information on Clyde, reviewing every transaction the man had made over the past decade. Eventually, Nick found out that Clyde owned property very close to the prison, giving him a new clue about the grand plan he was cooking up. Nick and his colleagues entered the property, shocked to see all the sophisticated equipment Clyde was suspected of using to plan his actions. They even found military-grade gear that confirmed Clyde was a serious threat. Even more surprising, Nick found a hidden tunnel that connected directly to every cell in the prison. From here, Nick realized Clyde had long since left his cell. They also discovered Clyde's notes, which contained plans for his next terror act, blowing up City Hall. Not wanting to waste any time, Nick and his police colleagues quickly headed to City Hall, the place they believed was Clyde's next target. Meanwhile, Clyde had successfully sneaked into City Hall and planted the bomb. When Nick and his team arrived, they quickly found a high-explosive bomb that was remotely controlled by a cell phone. One of Nick's colleagues warned that once activated, the bomb might only have a 30-second delay before it went off. Clyde returned to his hiding spot, only to be shocked to find Nick already there. In that moment, Nick tried to convince Clyde to give up his dangerous ambitions and return to a normal life like he had before. Unfortunately, Clyde ignored the advice. Without hesitation, he made a call from his phone, the one that triggered the bomb he had planted in City Hall. Seeing what Clyde was doing, Nick immediately fled the room. The bomb Clyde had planted had actually been moved by Nick to a new spot, right beneath the room. Nick quickly locked the door from the outside. Panicking, Clyde heard his phone ringing and realized the explosion would happen right beneath him. Moments later, a huge explosion shook the room. Clyde could only stare at the bracelet his child had given him, awaiting his inevitable fate. In the end, Nick realized that all of Clyde's actions were just a way to fix the legal system he saw as flawed. Nick then vowed to push for legal reform in a better way.